Hello, my name is Samantha DeLeo, and today I'm going to be talking about the Chris Benoit incident that happened in 2007. So, first, to start off, who was Chris Benoit? Chris Benoit was a famous WWE wrestler. He had been wrestling for 22 years. It was the only job, the only career he ever had. And he was really well loved in the wrestling community and in the community as a whole. He was known as a great guy, a great father, a great husband. He was just known as this very upstanding, great friend to people. And that's really important to remember as we go forward because his actions are the complete polar opposite of what he was known to be. Like his actions didn't align with what anyone thought he was capable of or could do. So Chris Benoit ended up murdering his wife and his son and then killing himself. And these events happened over a 3-day period. So on Friday, Chris strangled his wife Nancy with a telephone cord. And then on Saturday, June 23rd, Chris gave his 7-year-old son, Daniel, a Xanax to sedate him, and then Chris suffocated Daniel. And then on Sunday, June 24th, Chris went up to his home gym. He sat down on his lat pull-down bar, wrapped the metal cord around his neck, set the machine to 240 pounds, and then released, killing himself. And another point that I have here that I thought was very interesting was that on June 25th, the very next day, the WWE had made an entire 3-hour tribute, a 3-hour memorial for him before even knowing what had happened. They knew that Chris and his family had died, and that's all the information they knew. They didn't know that he had murdered his whole family and then killed himself. And so it's a 3-hour tribute of them talking about how amazing Chris was and wrestlers crying and talking about how they're going to miss him and he was a great person in the wrestling community and a great friend to all of them. And they didn't know what he did until 24 hours after that whole memorial went live on air on TV that night. So explaining this violence, there's many different paths and a lot of different avenues that you can go down to explain what Chris did and why he did what he did. But the theory that I chose was the psychopathology theory, which states that certain individuals suffer from mental illness, personality disorders, and other dysfunctions that cause them to engage in aggressive acts within the family. And I chose this one because, and I'll talk about this later, but Chris's brain was so severely damaged and had so much trauma, and he was suffering from a lot of mental illness that all of this mixed together was kind of the huge main cause to why Chris did what he did. And that contradicts what the media had initially stated. So going into that, first of all, Chris Benoit was completely blacklisted from all of WWE. They didn't want anything to do with his name once they found out what he had done. Other wrestlers weren't allowed to talk about him in interviews, and his name was completely wiped from all of WWE. That was the one thing that happened. And the actual media, how they portrayed Chris's death and what he did, they said that it was a result of roid rage and they blamed it on drug abuse. And that's how a lot of people, even today, perceive this whole incident as just an act of roid rage. And, this man abused a bunch of drugs and that's why he did what he did. And that just wasn't the case here. Roid rage is a quick snap judgment, a quick act of violence, and that's not what this was. This was a 3-day period of killing his wife, then the next day killing his son, and then the next day killing himself. This was not a quick snap judgment or a quick act of violence. And this made the media point their fingers at WWE and the drug enforcement programs that they have there, and they were blaming WWE for how they let these wrestlers do steroids and let them do all of these different drugs and how that's bad because it could lead down this same path that Chris went down. Even I have a picture here of a textbook that under steroid abuse and tragedy is Chris's story. And that's just not what the focus really is on in explaining why this happened. The big overall point to why Chris did this was because of his brain trauma. He had gone through so many concussions that he suffered from this thing called CTE, which is my next point. So CTE is chronic traumatic encephalopathy, And this is a progressive degenerative disease of the brain that is found in people with a history of repetitive brain trauma, which is what Chris had. Chris was a wrestler who, would get metal chairs hit on his head multiple times in a row, and his one move was dive bombing head first onto the ring. He would have so many concussions that it just basically turned his brain into mush. Um, a neuroscientist said that Benoit's brain was so severely damaged that it resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Another quote that I have from a neuroscientist is the degeneration of his brain changed who he was and what he was capable of. And I think that is a huge point to remember during this, because this act was not who Chris was as a whole and who Chris was seen as by his friends, his family, his fans, his peers, everyone around him. He was known as an amazing person, and this just didn't line up with who he was because his brain was so damaged that it had actually changed who he was. And so I think a big part of this in the prevention of this happening in the future or to someone else is just the awareness of what CTE is and how severely it can impact someone's brain and someone's life. And also going along with that is having stricter guidelines and safety precautions for athletes that they can put into place, especially for these very, very contact sports like wrestling and football, where their brains are getting so damaged during this that it can actually change who they are as a person and make them do acts that they would never do if this wasn't the case. I have a quote from Chris's dad who actually said that, I think if Chris Benoit had been anything other than a professional wrestler, he would still be alive. And I think that speaks volume to wrestling as a whole and how it can really damage your quality of life, and also, you know, how your life is in general, what you end up doing in your life, who you become as a person. Another part I think that needs to be talked about is ending the stigma of mental illness and reaching out for help. Another part of this story was that Chris had been going through a lot of personal struggle, a lot of mental illness, a lot of grief because his best friend and fellow wrestler Eddie Guerrero had died previously to Chris's incidents. And a lot of people say that this was kind of the last straw for Chris. Eddie was someone that he relied on and was kind of his person that he could that he knew was always there for him. And when that was taken away, all that was left really in Chris's life was his own thoughts. And that was so damaged that, it just left him to do what he did. And so if Chris had reached out after Eddie had died and gotten some help and tried to fix and work on himself, I really think that this could have helped and this could have been prevented. And I think just ending that whole stigma around mental illness as a whole is a huge aspect to this. And I think it could really solve and prevent a lot of trauma and a lot of violent acts in the future. And that is my presentation on Chris Benoit and what he did. Thank you.